Excellent. So now I'll share my screen and I'll invite you to join me in the blessing for study. If you'd like to unmute so that we can hear each other while we say the blessing, now is a good time to do that. And let's join together. Baruch atah
Adonai, Eloheinu melech
asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav
v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Blessed is the one whose mitzvot bring holiness to our lives and who commands us to immerse ourselves, to engage ourselves in words of Torah. So like I said, in a minute, we're going to look at some Heschel. We'll talk about who Heschel is and what it is that he has to say. But our overall topic for today is the topic of awe. We're going to talk about awe and hope. What is the relationship between awe and hope? And before we try to define awe, I would love to invite you not to think about what is awe, but to think about a moment when you experienced awe. And let's use the chat function for this. If you don't mind to just put a few words in the chat, tell us some moment when you experienced awe. I see some good ones there. Seeing my first grandchild being born. Oh, at Niagara Falls for the first time. Yes, it's a beautiful location. Seeing budding leaves on a plant. The birth of a son. Birth of a first grandbaby. I love that. Breathtaking, right? I experience awe in nature and when chanting Torah and when looking at my cats. So those are, it's interesting, those are two very very different experiences, being in nature, being in ritual, the chanting of Torah, and also relationship with cats who are our friends, right? Our pets are part of our family. And so I would suggest that that's relational. Birth of children, C-section born puppies, spoken like a vet there, Robert. Flamingos at sunset. Boy, you guys have seen some cool things in the world, let me tell you. Flying over the East Coast as the leaves have changed, right? Seeing it from above, seeing it from below is also quite awe-inspiring. And then finally, studying Buber's Tales of the Hasidim. I got stopped in my tracks over and over again. Dennis, I will pay you later because let me just take this opportunity to mention that I'm going to be offering a short class in September about Hasidic tales for the High Holy Days, specifically taken from Martin Buber's Tales of the Hasidim. So there's your commercial for something coming up in September. At any rate, I see a bunch of different things here. I see nature, a lot of awe in nature. I see a lot of awe with regard to the birth of children, which I think is two things. I think it's about relationships and love, and it's also about the magic of, or the awe-inspiringness of the process of birth, the fact that there can be birth. And I see a lot of here about ritual and connection and relationships, and there's a lot that brings us into awe. As we enter into this text from Abraham Joshua Heschel, he's going to be talking about the relationship between awe and hope. And I actually was drawn to this text specifically because he uses the word hope. And of course, our point here is always to talk about hope, to talk about tikvah. But hope is actually not his main point. It's a little bit ancillary to what he's really doing, which is trying to define the importance of awe. We're going to bring it back around to hope as we work our way through his texts. So Abraham Joshua Heschel, a name that I'm sure all of you know, is a 20th century rabbi. I think he died in 1971. And he was, for most of his career, especially the last 20 years or so years of his career, a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, the Conservative Movement Seminary. Before that, he had taught at the Hebrew Union College, which is the Reform Movement Seminary in Cincinnati, where I was ordained long before I studied there. And before that, he had come from Germany, well, actually from Poland originally. He was born in Warsaw, did his PhD in Germany. What's important for Heschel here is that he comes out of a Hasidic background. In fact, Heschel was supposed to be a Hasidic Rebbe. Abraham Joshua Heschel is named for his great-grandfather, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. In fact, some of you have heard me say this before, but Heschel's actual full name was Abraham Joshua Heschel, because he was named for his great-grandfather Abraham Joshua Heschel, and then he also had his last name Heschel. So apparently his wife used to call him Heschel, which was not the second one, but the first one, the one that was his middle name. So he comes from this Hasidic background, and part of Hasidic Judaism is the cultivation of awe in the world, experiencing awe in relation to God. The Hasidic Rebbes really, in some ways, rebel against the idea that Judaism is only or especially about doing the mitzvot and following what's commanded of you. And they say that Judaism is also about being and finding yourself in the presence of God. And so Heschel brings that from his Hasidic background into liberal Judaism. This is from his book, God in Search of Man, which is Heschel's great philosophical treatise. He writes, "The beginning of wisdom is awe." And by the way, I have no particular agenda with regard to these texts other than to ask you to please help me work out what the heck Heschel is saying here, because he's not always so easy to read, and yet he's incredibly eloquent as he talks about awe and hope and fear. So the beginning of wisdom is awe. He writes, "Ultimate meaning and ultimate wisdom are not found within the world, but in God. And the only way to wisdom is, as said above, through our relationship to God. That relationship is awe. Awe in this sense is more than an emotion. It is a way of understanding. Awe is itself an act of insight into a meaning greater than ourselves." There's a lot here. I think we could probably spend our full half hour on this paragraph alone. He has suggested that wisdom and meaning are not found only within the world, but in relationship with with God. Then he says that that relationship with God is awe. And then finally, he says that awe is an act of insight into meaning greater than ourselves. That's where I want to start. What does that mean? When Heschel says that the experience of awe is an act of insight into a meaning greater than ourselves, what is he trying to get across to us? What is he trying to have us understand? Anybody who can parse that sentence for us? Susan, please.
I'll give it a shot. Well, maybe I'll give an example. I was once hiking in the Joyce Kilmer wilderness area, and I sat down on a tree stump or something, and I said to myself, it was in the Smoky Mountains, why do we need great cathedrals when we have this? And I was awestruck. And I think that in searching for meaning outside of ourselves, we have to step out of our self-centeredness and our self-centered nature and see and feel, really. I think it's a feeling that something is bigger than me. And while I may or may not call that God, I don't know, but I do call that awe. And when I have that feeling, I am outside of myself. I am not the person who cleans up after the cats or whatnot. I'm elevated, lifted up. And one thing that Heschel said, I'll just sort of throw in here, is that you have to pray. You should pray with your feet. And in that, he was speaking of when he marched with Martin Luther King. And that was certainly something greater than himself. And they were seeking something greater than their individual selves. They were seeking something that would give insight to the world and the way the world thought about people.
Great, great, great. Okay.
I'll stop rambling.
Thank you. Oh, Susan, you've said so much. Let me say one thing, and then we're going to move to Susan Proctor, and then Lauren. And
I hope that's saved somewhere, because I didn't save it.
This will be, you can rewatch what you said later so that you can hear what you said, which was really quite profound. Some of what I heard earlier when we were talking about awe was about connectivity or connection to the world, to other people. So much of being in awe is about recognizing that there is something outside of you. And so I think when Heschel says that awe is an act of insight into meaning greater than ourselves, he is saying that when we are in awe, we recognize that there is more than just us. My quintessential example for myself is looking up at the stars and feeling very, very small. And it's amazing that looking up at the stars can make you feel small, but also big at the same time, meaning, in the Psalms, it talks about, God, what are we that you are mindful of us? I'm so nothing, I'm so tiny, and yet my life matters. So that is, for me, what comes out of awe. Susan Proctor, and then Lauren, and then Bob. And Susan, you'll need to unmute there.
Unmute, okay. For me, awe is a feeling of being touched by Shekinah. I remember feeling it the first time I put a talit over my head and said the prayer. And it happens in a place where there are no words. I think that's why it's hard to explain a spiritual experience, to explain awe in words.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, and so you're pointing out a different kind of connection, right? When Susan Kaplan sits in the forest and says, why do we need cathedrals? Here I am in God's cathedral. She's feeling connected to the universe through nature. When you put your talit over your head, you're feeling maybe connected to people, to the Jewish people, to a tradition, to our people's striving for the divine. These are all ways that we cultivate awe. You can see where the hope is coming in, right? Because the hope here is the sense that we transcend ourselves and we transcend our own inner world to become connected with others through awe. So Lauren, and then Bob, and then I think we'll come back to Heschel. Oh no, just Lauren.
Well, I think you just pretty much said what I was thinking. It's in context of this course here. Awe is a coming to terms, or one of the definitions of awe for me is the coming to terms with the understanding of hope. And for that, you have to delve within yourself. And so maybe it's great. It's not only greater than yourself, and that's something that occurs that is greater than your understanding, but also within yourself, uncovering the tenets and the understanding of what it is to connect with hope, because that in itself is an incredibly exhilarating and what's the word, unfolding type of an experience. So I think
yeah, there's some kind of learning that comes out of the experience of awe. In fact, Heschel says something similar, and truly, when he says it, he's just quoting the book of Proverbs. So take a look where he goes next. The question, therefore, where shall wisdom be found, is answered by the psalmist, that the awe of God is the beginning of wisdom. The Bible does not preach awe as a form of intellectual resignation. In other words, it's not just awe for awe's sake. There's a purpose. It does not say that awe is the end of wisdom. The point isn't just to be in awe. The intention seems to be that awe is a way to wisdom. In Job, we encounter the complete equation. The awe of God is wisdom. And what Heschel's doing here is quoting this passage from the book of Proverbs, where it says, Yirat Adonai Reshit Da'at. The fear of the eternal, or we might translate as the awe of the eternal, is the beginning of knowledge. And then it says, fools despise wisdom and discipline. By the way, if you haven't studied the book of Proverbs, very much worth spending some time with the book of Proverbs. It's filled with all kinds of really good, timeless insight. So one thing that's really important here is the opening word of this passage. This word right here, yirah. What does yirah mean? It's translated here as fear, but it also means awe. The word yirah has a kind of a dual meaning in Hebrew. It doesn't map perfectly onto any word in English because it doesn't mean fear. There's another word for fear in Hebrew, which is pachad. Like if I'm afraid of something, then I'm in pachad. But yirah is more like the fear of experience something awe-inspiring. And so what it's really saying here, this is a bad translation. What it's really saying here is that the awe of God is the beginning of knowledge. How is being in awe the beginning of knowledge? I think it's something like what Lauren just said, which is to say that when we experience awe, we turn outward and we realize how small we are, but we also are turned inward. Awe inspires in us a sense that our lives and that our world matters, which I think leads us toward wanting to explore what it is to make meaning in the world. In the movie Avatar, I don't know if some of you have seen the movie Avatar, they say it is hard to fill a cup that is already full. And I think that's part of what's going on here. If your cup is full, then you have nothing to learn. But the minute you're in awe, the minute you feel small, the minute you are aware of everything else that's around you, you know that you have a lot to learn. And knowing you have a lot to learn is actually in itself the beginning of wisdom. Bob, go ahead.
Yirah also links to seeing, and much of the things that we have put down have to do with seeing things, maybe all of them, and that's a little bit of a problem for those of us who are blind.
That's been your theme for the last couple of weeks, Bob, I have to say, this turn in the Torah towards seeing. And yeah, so interestingly enough, you're all good. It's good. It's good to see these connections. Interestingly enough, I believe that the word yirah and the word ra'ah, to see, actually are not related to each other, but they do have two of the three letters of the root in common, which that's the kind of thing that the Midrash has a heyday with, right? So I could be wrong and maybe they are related, but even if they're not related, we still get to write that Midrash, that seeing what's around us, whether physically seeing or whether opening our minds to the knowledge of that there is much around us, is the outcome of awe. When we are in awe, we actually see more. So let's talk about hope now. According to the Bible, the principal religious virtue is yirah. Yirah, remember, means awe/fear. What is the nature of yirah? The word has two meanings, fear and awe. There is the man who fears the Lord lest he be punished in his body, family, or in his possessions. Another fears the Lord because he is afraid of punishment in the life to come. Both types are considered inferior in Jewish tradition. Heschel is essentially saying, the point isn't fear. The point isn't to act out of fear. In fact, when we act out of fear, it seems to me that we are not holding hope. Acting out of fear is actually the opposite of hope, because it is an action that states that you believe that there may be no other possibility other than the fear-based possibility. Fear, he says, is anticipation or expectation of evil or pain, as contrasted with hope, which is the anticipation of good. Let me read that sentence again. Fear is the anticipation of evil or pain, as contrasted with hope, which is the anticipation of good. Awe, on the other hand, he says, is the sense of wonder and humility inspired by the sublime or felt in the presence of mystery. Fear is a surrender to the succors which reason offers. Awe is the acquisition of insights which the world holds in store for us. Awe, unlike fear, does not make us shrink from the awe-inspiring object, but on the contrary, draws us near to it. This is why awe is compatible with both love and joy. So if I walk through the world in fear, How will I behave? I will circle the wagons. I will protect. I will close myself off to that which is unfamiliar. If I walk through the world with awe, then Heschel says, I will be drawn near. I will be opened up to. When I look up at the stars and I feel in awe, it doesn't make me shrink away. It makes me interested. It makes me curious. It makes me want to connect with the world out there. In some way, I think Heschel is saying that awe is our route to hope. Awe, feeling inspired by awe, is the route to feeling more hopeful and opening yourself up to the possibility of tikkun, of repairing that which is not yet repaired. Susan, go ahead.
Well, I don't think it is that they are mutually exclusive, fear and awe, because sometimes engaging in something that frightens you can lead to awe. For example, I once climbed this cliff in my youth in Maine, in Acadia, called the Beehive. And I didn't go up the easy way mistakenly. I climbed up where you had to grab onto rungs and ladders and whatnot. And I had a walking stick that I had since I'd been in the Smoky Mountains years before, that I had to let go of. And I just kept saying, don't look down. But when I got to the top, I said, oh, wow, I did it. And I looked around and I was in awe. I was in awe of what I had done. I had faced my fear. So I think to be bound by fear leads to is the antithesis of awe, but to feel the fear and do it anyway, as somebody once said, is the beginning of a journey towards awe.
Oh, that's cool. I like that. To feel fear is the beginning of the journey towards awe, right? I mean, emotions aren't bad, right? The presence of fear is not in and of itself a bad thing. The question is, what do we do when we feel fear? Do we circle the wagons? Do we turn inward and protect? Or do we tell ourselves, I have the capacity to make my way through this? And I think maybe the question is, how do you do the one versus the other? What is the route toward, if I'm afraid of something, what is the route toward knowing that I have the capacity versus shrinking away from it because I'm afraid of it? Vicky, go ahead.
Oops. I think it's maybe it's an internal sense of, I've got to move through this, and not, and it's like feel the fear and keep moving anyway. You have to have that little hope within you, even though to keep moving through. I'm looking at this as through a survivor's head through, and I can feel the fear, yet I haven't. I mean, I needed help to do this, but I can feel the fear and yet move through it, and there is that sense of awe afterwards. I can do it. It lifts me up then to do the same thing, to keep moving forward, and therefore I learn, I'm curious, and all that. So it's not being, as Susan said, bound by that fear or moving through the world or in anger and resentment, which
Thank
is
you.
then being bound by that fear. So,
Yeah, thank you for that. I wonder, when we talk about awe as being sort of the sense of something larger than yourselves, sometimes we mean that in a theological sense, as in God is out, is out there protecting me. And Heschel, I'll share my screen one more time. Heschel quotes Psalm 27, which, by the way, this is the psalm for Elul. We're about a month and a half away from Elul, which is that month that opens the High Holy Days. Heschel quotes this: the Lord is my light and my help, whom shall I fear? In other words, if I have God with me, then what do I have to fear? God is protecting me. But I wonder, for those of us who struggle with the idea of a supernatural God, who may not believe necessarily in a God out there who's protecting me all the time, who might see God as, in nature, or God in connection, or God in, as Kaplan would say, the powers in the world that make for meaning. I wonder if this yirah, this sense of awe that there is something larger than ourselves, is also the faith in ourselves. The faith in ourselves to know that we are capable of moving through, right? Is the difference between the person who shrinks in fear, or the moments in our lives when we shrink in fear, versus the moments in our lives when we move through fear. Is it the awe that gives us faith that we have powers, protective powers, call them divine powers, call it God watching over us, to help us move through whatever is hard. Which brings me to one last passage here. Here I'm going to quote myself from a sermon that I gave in 2020, but it's me quoting somebody else. I decided to just bring the sermon I wrote rather than actually going to search for the source that I originally wrote this for. This is from Professors Dasher Keltner and Jonathan Haidt, both of whom are psychologists, part of the positive psychology movement. And they're writing here about awe. I said that they've broken down the feeling of awe into two experiences: perceived vastness and need for accommodation. Perceived vastness is exactly what it sounds like: the awareness of something that is experienced as being much larger than the self. It could be physical vastness, like a mountain or a redwood, or it could be something like prestige or intricacy, or the vast complexity of a work of art or music. Somebody talked about looking at the leaves. That's something larger than ourselves. When we experience these things, we feel small. We feel ourselves to be part of something larger. The second feature of awe, need for accommodation, refers to what happens in our brains. It is when we experience something that causes our conception of the world to shift or expand in order to make sense of this new experience. Seeing a billion stars, contemplating the intricacy of a tree. These things actually invite us to rewire our brains, to open up our minds in order to accept the existence of more and greater things in our world. So it seems to me that there is nothing more hopeful than that which inspires us to think bigger, to open up our minds to possibilities, both the possibilities within ourselves and the possibilities outside of ourselves. Because you can't solve the problems in the world unless you believe that it's possible to solve the problems in the world. And in order to believe that it's possible, we need to feel ourselves in awe. So over the next 3 weeks, as we're not studying together, I would invite us to find opportunities to experience awe, whether it's seeing the stars, or whether it's connecting with loved ones, or whether it's taking a walk in the woods, or calling up an old friend. All of these, they are experiences that open us up, that help us to be the hope that, and to embody the hope that the world can become better. So I hope you have a really nice few weeks. Thank you for this discussion, everybody. And I look forward to seeing you back here on August 22nd as we continue this search for hope in the world. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Oh, thanks, Bruce. I like your comment there about awesome session.
Have a good 3 weeks.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.